We were so grateful to hear from John Andrews last night. I mean, just what a beautiful sermon and celebration with John with Ananias, and now with Linda from Christian Ways. So Remington's going to introduce, but I just wanted to just take a moment to say, like, this is really a special thing to be together and to have these people here, these leaders, people whose this mission has been on their hearts for many years. And we can just really thank God for that. And as we move forward and listen, to really just take that, put that on our hearts. So,
Dr. Linda Kramer is the author of The Religion That Kills, also known as Perfect Peril, as some of you may know, a book apologetic in nature about Christian Science and helping people to see the way that mind control is involved in some of the abuse that takes place there. We were talking this morning, and she expressed to me that one of the difficulties about what she does is that she's not just come out of Christian Science, like those of you who are here, but she's actually someone who has come out and is now turned back to that group and is speaking the truth in contradiction to the group that she came out of. And that is a very difficult thing to do. But we're so glad to have Dr. Linda Kramer here to tell us about From Peril to Peace, a journey, a book, and a ministry.
Hi, it's great to see you guys today. Some of you I've known for years, some of you I've only known by screen names on a Christian Way. It's fun to connect the screen names with the real names. And a number of you I've just met, so anyway, I'm delighted to be here. As you can see, my talk is From Peril to Peace, a journey, a book, and a ministry. And it has truly been a journey. I came out of Christian Science in 1985. Many, many years to become free. I was out of it, it was not out of me. And my journey, surprisingly, led me to a book and to a ministry. And so I'm just going to tell you my story. And in the process, you'll know what my struggles were and the things I learned and the things I was able to turn on and share with other people. So I grew up in Christian Science. My mother her mom converted when my mom was a preschooler. So my mom was raised in it all her life. My father converted aboard a submarine in World War II. The skipper of his sub was a Christian Scientist and would have Christian Science services on the ship. And so my dad converted. So he was very staunch in it. And I had a happy family. I had a couple of siblings. We were very close, good parents, loving parents. So it was great. I loved Christian Science. And one of the reasons I had so much trouble leaving was because I loved my background, I loved my family, I loved Christian Science. I joined Mother Church when I was able to, I don't know if it was age 12 or 14, but I joined Mother Church. I attended Principia College for 4 years, majored in chemistry. Absolutely loved Prin, had a great time there. I was active in my college organization at the University of Illinois. I was one of the people that put the readings together and everything, so I was very involved in it. Married a non-practicing Lutheran, and he was fine to go to church with me, so we'd go to the Christian Science church. And I later said to him, "How did you sit through that?" And he said, "Well, if something doesn't make sense, I just block it out." So all these years he was sitting in church and just like shielding himself from it, so that was good. So why did I leave, and how in the world did I end up writing a book? It all started when I had my first child. We've all heard stories about parents who get in trouble when they have a child who has some sort of a problem and they can't heal it, and then there's a question, you go to the doctor, do you heal it? I didn't want to get in a situation where I was putting my child in any kind of danger because I wasn't as good a healer as I wanted to be. So I thought, well, Christian Science claims to be based on the Bible, and if it's based on the Bible, and I haven't been as good as I want to be to this point, if I set science and health aside a little bit and just read straight through the Bible, then it ought to give you a better basis for understanding Christian Science. And I was, at that point in my life, I was ready, I assumed that it would support Christian Science, but I was ready for whatever truth is true. So I started reading the New Testament in the King James Version, which is what we were all raised with CS, and that's fine in the Gospel, but when you get to Roman in the King James Version, it doesn't fly so well just reading straight through, because it's just really tough stuff. So, back up a little bit, in the meantime, a family had come into my life that were Christian, and I had offered Christian Science to them because the wife had rheumatoid arthritis, and I said, Christian Science heals, I'm going to offer this to you. I'm not as good a healer as I'd like to be, but it's the truth. So they looked into it, and that opened up an opportunity for them to tell me what they believed, and for me to tell them what I believed. And being a Christian Scientist, we know that we had the spiritual interpretation of the Bible words and everything, and so everything they said sounded really kindergarten to me. You know, I had the graduate school level of understanding of the Bible, and they had a kindergarten understanding. So, you know, in your mind, you sort of pat them on the head and say, that's very sweet. So, I kept reading, and later on, a few months later, I said to them, can we have a conversation? I'd just like to know what other Christians believe. In my mind, there was Christian Science belief, and there was the other Christians. I had no idea that the various denominational names had a reason. You know, there's many different, there's core beliefs, and then there's all the peripheral stuff, and I thought it was just CS and everything else. So we had an opportunity to have a conversation, and again, they told me what they believe about Jesus, and why he came to the cross, and are heaven and hell real, and blah, 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 and again, everything they said sounded really kindergarten to me. And I can remember going into the bathroom, and I heard the wife saying to the husband, that was great how you said this and this and this, and I'm thinking, didn't mean anything to me. So anyway, they said, just keep reading the Bible, you're fine. So July 6th, 1985, I'm sitting on my couch, and I'm into Romans, and I've switched to the modern translation, which I had from my Principia days when I had taken a class on the Old Testament and we used a modern translation. And I came upon Romans 3:23, and it said, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forth as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. And I went, I have never seen that before, and it backs up every kindergarten thing my friends have been saying. It's like, this is in the Bible, they're telling me what's in the Bible. Oh my goodness. So sitting there on my couch that day, it changed my life. I've never been the same since that moment, and I realized that Jesus died not to prove the unreality of sin, sickness, and death, not to show that we are not separated from God at all, but he died for my sins because all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and we all need a Savior. So it was amazing, and from that moment on, I began to sense little changes in my life. I was a very moral person, Christian Science, you know, that it teaches you a good moral foundation. But I kept realizing that there was like fine-tuning in my attitudes and my values and everything, and I'm like, I didn't know I felt that way. So it was clear that God was coming in and he was kind of tweaking me over the next weeks. Well, I had a problem, and that is that suddenly Christian Science and the Bible were on opposite sides of the discussion, and I had to reconcile that. So one by one, well, these issues would come up, you know. Who's the Holy Spirit? What is the Holy Spirit? What is heaven? What is hell? Are they real? Why did Jesus die on the cross? Is he God? Is he not? Is he the way shower? You know, all those issues that are central to Christianity. And they come up one at a time. And I was a PhD chemist working in industry, so I had a full-time job, I had a child, I had a husband, and I was already working at peak capacity when all this started. So I was already sort of on the edge, physically and mentally, because I was, you know, high-powered type A kind of person. And so I was staying up till 1, 2 in the morning and getting up at 6. And so for 6 weeks, I was just burning the candle at both ends while I worked through these theological issues. And every single time, I couldn't reconcile Christian Science to what the Bible was saying. Every single time I had to realize there's an either or. There's not a spiritual interpretation. So by the end, the one issue that kept coming up was, is Jesus God? Because in Christian Science, you talk about the Christ and Jesus, you talk about the Christ idea and the man Jesus, but the Bible talks about Jesus Christ altogether, the incarnate God. And I can remember putting in the margin of my Bible, Jesus doesn't equal God, and later when I went back and looked at that, I'm like, it says Jesus is God, but at the time I couldn't see it. So I went to my friends, and this issue kept looming and looming and looming, despite all the other things going on. So I went back to my friends and I said, show me a verse that shows that Jesus is God. And they showed me a verse, and I said, oh, that's interesting, I'll go home and look at it. So I went home, opened the Bible, looked at the verse, and went, oh my goodness, Jesus is God incarnate. So I went back to my friends and I said, that verse was great. And they looked at it and they said, that's not the verse we gave you. So God had given me their verse to begin with, and then a backup verse of his choosing to cement the deal for me. And that's when the 6-week boot camp experience ended, was when I finally had that issue settled. So now, okay, I'm a Bible-believing Christian. I'm growing leaps and bounds. I've got a pastor who's willing to disciple me, which he did, which was wonderful. But I've got a big problem, and that is that the religion of my family, my roots, my past, my love, my worldview is no longer the religion that I can follow. And I've got another problem, and that is by this time I'm sick. Because remember, I was burning the candle at both ends, and it finally takes a physical toll. And it turned out I had a pinched nerve in my neck. I had some blood sugar issues that were simply because I wasn't eating properly. So I went to a doctor, and I'm like, what's wrong with me? And they gave me a bad diagnosis and the wrong treatment, which sometimes happens in medicine, but most of us, if you're schooled in medicine, or if you're a normal person, you can kind of evaluate what kind of care you're getting. I had no idea. I had no idea how to present my symptoms, or I just was ignorant on the whole thing. So I didn't recognize that things weren't going well, and I got even sicker. So by the end of a few months, I was basically emotionally done. I was physically, I had to stop working for a couple months, because I was just plain sick. As a former Christian Scientist, what are we all taught? That if you leave Christian Science, you open yourself up to aggressive mental suggestion, and oh my goodness, things might happen. So not only am I sick, I'm really embarrassed. Because as a Christian Scientist, I know what I used to think of people when they would leave. It was just, oh, they didn't understand. Sorry, pat them on the head. And so now I was embarrassed, and I was seeming to support the idea that bad things happen to people that leave, although there was a very logical explanation for it at the time. It's just mortifying. So remember I started this in early July. By September, I had to take a couple months off work, and the doctor said, go see a therapist and see if there's an emotional component to this. And of course, for a Christian Scientist to go see a shrink is a double whammy, because that's really embarrassing, because everything in Christian Science has to do with your state of mind, your understanding, and so send me to a shrink, are you crazy? Well, maybe I'm crazy. But anyway, I went defiantly and was very surprised when the shrink said, yeah, you should start therapy. So defiantly I did, and very quickly found out that I did need therapy. The problem was that it was the wrong kind of therapy. There's various techniques. The particular technique that I started in on was one that was not appropriate for someone with the needs I had. It basically takes a person apart and puts them back together, but it does it in a way that doesn't allow for any religious feeling. Anytime I mention God, my therapist would sort of try to describe it away, or rationalize it away. It just wasn't the right thing for me. And I was going 4 days a week, and it was just torturous. It caused some problems that later I switched to another Christian therapist, and we were able to put some of the pieces back together, and that's okay. But there was some value that came out of the difficult therapy, and that is that it forced me to face life head on. As Christian Scientists, we were always reinterpreting the events in our lives and redefining things. And it really forced me to face what had gone on in my life. 30 years of improperly managed emotions. All came back, one after another. So it's one thing if you process them as they go, but if they all come back to you, 30 years worth all at once, it was pretty overwhelming. So I needed to undo my thinking, my CS thinking patterns, and I really needed to face life as I had experienced it and not as I had interpreted it. Some of the things were minor, some of the things were major traumas. They all came together and they all needed to be dealt with. So I learned in the 11 months in that therapy situation, I learned just how deeply bitter I could be. I was a nice person. I was shocked that I could be that angry and that bitter, that deep inside. And so even though I had accepted Jesus' payment for my sins a year before, I didn't really understand the depth of sin. And as I began to see how ugly sin can be as it came to the forefront of my emotions, I began to really understand the gift of salvation. And that was the sweetest lesson I've ever learned. It was worth going through all the agony to realize that sin is ugly and that Jesus paid for my sins. I learned to feel true, raw human emotion, and eventually I learned to forgive. In 1988, I was expecting my second child, and I loved being a counselor. I loved my job. It was the kind of thing I'd go to work, and it didn't matter if it was Friday or not. It was just, I got a kick out of being a chemist. And one night I stayed up almost all night. I was having this discussion with God. I want to serve you, but can I serve you at work? No. And the answer for me at that time came, no, you need to be home. You need to serve me at home right now. So before my child was born, my daughter, I quit my job and became a stay-at-home mom and became busy with mothering full-time and getting involved in my neighborhood and all the things that you do when you're not at work full-time. And my issues, my CS issues kind of subsided and life got good for a while. My husband, a couple months after I quit work, who'd been sort of watching from the sidelines, he's watching his wife go through this horrific experience after becoming a Christian. He's like, yeah, I want to do that. But the Lord reached out to him and he accepted the Lord as his Savior. And now I had him in my camp. Part of the problem of being in CS was feeling so alone. And my husband, we always had a good marriage, but he wasn't at the same place I was spiritually. And so I felt very, very alone. And once he came alongside, it was really a help. But it was clear that I was still struggling with my Christian Science past. If I would hear negative things about it, it would really upset me. And there were a few times I was asked to give talks. I teach the Sunday school class, What is Christian Science? And I wept through the whole presentation because I was so sad. When I had left, I used to cry through the hymns. A lot of Christian Science hymns were taken from standard Christianity. So you're reading it, you're going through the hymnal in church, and there's this hymn that was one you used to sing in the CS church with appropriate tweakings to take theological things out that shouldn't be there for a Christian Scientist. But I would read through those hymns, and I was just so homesick. So about 10 years after leaving Christian Science, I had a conversation with somebody I loved who was CS, and it just threw me into turmoil again. It created a crisis that was just months and months of building anxiety. And I think it was because I realized this person, from that conversation, I realized this person is never going to leave. He's never going to leave Christian Science, but he's never going to accept the Jesus of the Bible. It just really triggered a crisis of totally being alone. And during this time, I came across a book called Out of the Cults and Into the Church by Janice Hutchinson. And she had been in a sort of an offshoot of Mormonism, sort of a really radical offshoot, and had been kept prisoner for a while and had a tough experience. And so she was working with cult victims, and you can call, there's two definitions for a cult, and one is the theological definition, is it claiming to be Christian, but it denies certain key Christian things like the deity of Jesus. And there's also the definition of cult that is, and maybe the reason I'm having such trouble is because Christian Science has a hold on me. So through a series of events, I was connected with a residential facility for cult victims, and it's called Wellspring Retreat and Resource Center. It's a little tiny facility. It's a house, basically, and it was run by Christians, and they invite people who've been in cultic situations or in high-demand relationships. A cult can be an organization, it can be a religious group, it can be a self-help group, it can be a sales group, it can be a one-on-one relationship. Anytime somebody or something is unduly controlling somebody, it's a cultic situation. And so they would invite people to come and spend a couple of weeks and go through their program. And their program involved two aspects. One was therapy, counseling, and the other was education. What is mind control? How do you recognize it? How do you look at your situation and say, okay, was I being unduly controlled, or did I do this knowingly? So I spent the 2 weeks there, and the program they took us through was Robert J. Lifton's criteria for thought reform. Back in the 1950s, during the Korean War, it was noticed that our POWs were coming home from Chinese prison camps spouting pro-communist jargon. They were like, what? Why is this happening? So they studied the things that go on in the Chinese prison camps and identified some criteria that could be used to change someone's mind without them realizing it. They also looked at the Chinese universities where students weren't captive, they'd come there by choice, but they also came out sounding very similar to POWs. So what are the dynamics where you can take somebody and change their mind without their consent? And Lifton identified 8 criteria that the more they're present, the more the control occurs. You can start the slides now. I don't have a pointer, so if you go to sleep, I'm going to get you. Okay, how does somebody fall under somebody else's control? It starts with a need. It's a time of transition, it's a time of loss. A college kid leaves home, goes to school, they're all alone, they're feeling vulnerable. Somebody comes in, fills the need, invites them over, or takes care of them, fills whatever the needs are. And it can be an organization, come to my church or come to my organization, or it can be just an individual. It's wonderful at first, but you don't get the whole story. And over time, the demands on you become greater and greater. And because everybody's been so wonderful, you try to conform a little to fit in, and you conform more and more and more over time. And pretty soon, you sort of lost touch with who you were, and now you're remade in the image and the attitudes of the group or the person that's taking care of you, or that's brought you in. And they convince you that you can't live without them, so it's really hard to leave. So that's the basic pattern that happens. If Lifton's criteria are there, it makes it easier for this control to happen. Okay, sorry. Okay, so how do you brainwash someone? First of all, you're going to control the information. He calls that milieu control. You're going to control what they hear, what they read. You're also going to control what they can think and what they can say. So externally there's filters and internally there's filters. And what this does is it removes you from the input you had before, so that it makes it harder to question what the group is telling you. You manipulate the circumstances. It's called mystical manipulation. The leader usually claims some special authority. Usually it's like divine authority. I got my message straight from God, so who are you to argue? And that allows them to interpret events that support the divine authority of the leader and also support the doctrine. In one cult, there was a lot of cults are more overt than Christian Science. They control where you live, what you eat, that sort of thing. In one of these cults, the diet they had, their members on was one that was lacking in certain nutrients, and so they were malnourished. And one form of malnourishment, you get little breaking of, what do they call, blood vessels, and so you get rosy cheeks. So this group would say, okay, if you get the rosy cheeks, that's a sign that you're becoming like a child, you're a childlike faith. So their members were being malnourished, but thinking that as they were malnourished, that the signs of malnourishment were actually a sign of their greater faith. You also divide the world into good and bad, right and wrong, and you impose unachievable standards, and that's called the demand for truth. Overemphasize the need to confess one's fault. That's called the cult of confession, and a lot of times in groups people confess their shortcomings, and then that makes them vulnerable and easily used, and that makes them more easily controlled. Create a sacred science to support the teachings and the doctrines. It's sacred because it's from a source that can't be questioned. I got my information from God. Who are you to question? It's a science because it's precise, must be followed exactly, and it explains anything you need. Change the meanings of words and introduce thought-stopping cliches. A thought-stopping cliche might be everyone who isn't in this religion or this group is the unenlightened, or they're instruments of Satan, or they're stupid, or whatever. So that why would you listen to them if they come and try to talk to you about the shortcomings of your group? You're not going to listen because who are they to tell you? Because they've been labeled as something not worth listening to. Okay. Subjugate personal experience to the doctrine. This is called doctrine of a person. Group members are taught to ignore or experiences or thoughts that conflict with the doctrine. It doesn't seem right to you, but the doctrine says it's okay, so it has to be okay. Make it hard to leave the group. Label outsiders as unenlightened, etc. There may be shunning of members who leave, so it's really hard to leave because you know you're going to lose all your friends. Teach that leaving the group will bring danger, illness, damnation, etc. And tell members that they make it clear to them that they really can't function without the group. The more of these 8 criteria that are present in any situation, the more controlling the situation can be on an individual. Okay.
Anybody keep a score? 8 out of 8.
So I was at Wellspring, and remember, they didn't know if it was a cult either, so we were talking through it, and the more we talked, their eyes got big, and they're like, wow, this is amazing. Christian Science doesn't overtly control you by telling you what to eat and where to live and all that, but they definitely control you, and it's more internal controls that are inherent in the doctrine itself. And so it became clear to us that Christian Science does operate as what they said, a very sophisticated kind of cult. Very sophisticated kind of mind control, because it is more internal and external. So let's look at Christian Science and Lifton. Do they fit? The need. The need is usually healing. Maybe something else, but 9 times out of 10, somebody had something they needed to get healed. It wasn't working with medicine. They came to Christian Science. The offer, spiritually scientific method of healing, that if you do it right, you will not fail at healing. Victory over life circumstances. Anything that happens, you can know the truth and have victory. And there's guaranteed salvation because Eddie says that either here or hereafter we'll all understand Christian Science. So when you pass from this life into a different state of consciousness, the problems you still have, you'll have then, but eventually everyone will work it out, and eventually everyone will be, quote, saved, and I think it's saved from belief in materiality. So there's no heaven or hell to worry about. It's just like some people get it sooner than others, but we'll all get it at some point. Okay. Moving. Yes. So we're going to look at, you're good. We're going to look at Lifton's criteria, and we're going to look at 7 of the 8. I didn't do cult of confession. There is a lot of self-confession of self-failure in CS, but I didn't treat it in the book because at the time I didn't quite have that one yet. So anyway, I treated 7 of the 8, which is pretty good. The milieu control, is external. In the early years, there was overt control. There were biographies that were Milmine, Catherine Milmine, Dakin, and Bates Littlemore biographies were in Mrs. Eddy's times or slightly thereafter. They were not flattering to her, and the Christian Science people would like go to try to suppress them from being published in the first place, and once they were published, they would go around and check the books out of the library and never return them, and buy up all the books and make them go away, and or suppress. There was intimidation of booksellers, so that some of the booksellers were afraid to sell these books. And in the second edition of the Dakin book, it actually talks about how the attempt at suppression of the book was so great that the publisher and the public got behind it, and that the book actually became sort of a tribute to the freedom of mind. So that's if you look at the 1930 edition of the book, the foreword is very interesting.
So what's the book called?
Mary Baker Eddy's Study of a Virginal Mind. Is that right?
Biography of a Virginal Mind.
Biography of a Virginal Mind. All right, another way of controlling the information is to teach you, you don't want to learn about the body and medical issues because the more you learn about it, the more susceptible you are to opening yourself up to the belief in disease. How many of you were excused from health class? Okay, internal, knowing the truth. Whenever we see an event that isn't perfect, we see an accident or somebody tells us, I have a cold, you might say, oh, I'm sorry, but internally, you're declaring that there's no such thing as a cold, you're declaring that the perfect child of God and all. So you're filtering the information even though you look like you're having a normal conversation. Okay. Mystical manipulation, there's a big chapter on this in my book. The first thing is the fall on the ice. What are we taught in Christian Science? The fall, Mrs. Eddy fell on the ice. She was expected to die. She read her Bible. In 3 days, she was healed and raised free. It was the falling apple, quote unquote, that led her to the discovery of how to be well and how to teach others to be well. The real story is that 6 months later, she tried to sue the city of Lynn because she was still suffering. And so that doesn't sound like a real instantaneous healing to me. So, anyway, just saying. So there's this mystical story built up around her. She claimed divine revelation. I have lots of quotes showing that in the book. And she told childhood stories that suggest she was called by God. Remember the story of Samuel in the Bible where he's audibly called by God? Well, she had a similar story where she was called. She blamed health and everybody blamed health and relationship problems on mental malpractice and animal magnetism. Now, animal magnetism is the belief that there's an existence, thought, or power apart from God. It's unreal, it has no power, but you better protect yourself against it. Mental malpractice is the injurious action of one mortal mind controlling another from wrong motives, and it's practiced either with a mistaken or a wicked purpose, and that's in science and health. The scary thing is that you can mentally malpractice somebody accidentally. And when the We Knew Mary Baker Eddy series is a series that was published with interviews and write-ups by, I think it was 18 people that actually worked in Mrs. Eddy's house who were her inner circle. And I forget which one of them tells about the first lesson Mrs. Eddy taught her when she came into the house was a lesson on learning about defending yourself from mental malpractice. And the woman's conclusion was, that was very apropos being in a household with 18 different personalities. These are Mrs. Eddy's best people. These are hand-picked people. And even they were subject to accidentally mentally malpracticing each other. So it tells you, even though it has no power and it's not real, it had a very powerful influence on people. Animal magnetism and mental malpractice were blamed for all manner of problems, including Mrs. Eddy's third husband, Ace's death. An autopsy showed heart problems. She publicly claimed that he was mentally murdered with arsenic poison mentally administered. And she actually blamed it on a certain student, I think it was Aaron's, who was a disaffected student. She actually, was it Aaron's or Howard? I forget. Anyway, one of her students, she actually blamed it on him. Negative thoughts about Mary Baker Eddy they must be the result of animal magnetism. Or if you have a negative thought about Mary Baker Eddy, somebody else is implanting that with mental malpractice. Direct attacks against Mary Baker Eddy. She even had students, she would write up what she called watches at night. They were basically perilous, things to defend herself against. She felt that she was the focal point of animal magnetism, and because she was the discoverer and founder of Christian Science, she was kind of the focal point of all this bad stuff. And so she would have her students pray over her all night and know the truth. And if she had a good night, she'd say, great work. And if she didn't have a good night, which was very frequent, she would blame them for not doing their protective work well enough. Discord between Christian scientists. Even bad weather was blamed on animal magnetism. She lived in New England, and in January 1910, she told students to make a law that there shall be no more snow this season. Yeah.
We had a rough winter in Cincinnati.
There was a lot of animal magnetism going on in Michigan, too. 93 inches of snow last week. It was crazy. It's just mental magnet, animal magnetism flying all through the sky in my driveway. Anyway, so the mystical manipulation, animal magnetism, and mental malpractice, all this unreal stuff that's very powerful if you let it be, gave Eddy and her followers an excuse for everything that didn't go right. You always had that excuse. So Christian Science was always right, and anything that didn't go right was because people hadn't protected themselves from the animal magnetism. You build a sacred science, and what the sacred science does, in Mrs. Eddy's case, it allowed her to change the meanings of all the important words in the English language, basically. In Christian Science, the sacred science was sacred because Christian Science was revealed to Mary Baker Eddy divinely. At one point, she told one of her students, Abigail Dyer Thompson, that every bylaw in the Mother Church manual is inspired. I did not write them any more than I wrote Christian Science, wrote Science and Health. I study science and health constantly. In other words, it all came divinely from God, and therefore it has to be true. It's a science because CS is precise, demonstrable, and able to explain all existence. And she said, if the student adheres strictly to the teachings of Christian Science and ventures not to break its rules, he cannot fail in successful healing. You load the language, you change what it means. And this is done all the time. Watch what the newspapers and everything have done to certain words in our English language. They don't mean what they meant 10 years ago. But this is a hallmark of controlling organizations, or people don't do this. In Christian Science, spiritual interpretations turn the English language upside down. Matter is unreal. Spirit is real. Substance is spiritual. So that should be, we think of that as substance, but all substance is truly spiritual, but is not really real. It just, wow. In terms of the Bible, terms like God, Holy Spirit, heaven, hell, Jesus, salvation, are given spiritual interpretations that are said to clarify the Bible, but actually they contradict the Bible. And that's why it's so hard to talk to Christian Scientists about the Bible. She also used complex sentence structure. How many of you were told in college that your sentences were too long and complicated and had too many commas, because that's the way Mary Baker Eddy wrote? This is one of my favorite quotes. She came up with the synonyms for God: principle, mind, soul, spirit, life, truth, and love, and then she uses them to define each other. Just listen to the sentence. God is what the scriptures declare him to be: life, truth, love. Spirit is divine principle, and divine principle is love, and love is mind. And mind is not both good and bad, for God is mind. Therefore, there is in reality one mind only, because there is one God. And this is part of a statement she made in a platform to demonstrate the infallibility of metaphysics. It's a totally circular argument. As long as you're inside the circle, you're like, oh, this is cool. But if you're outside the circle, you realize there's no logic to it. All right, As I said, the lingo makes talking to non-Christian science discussions very difficult. Consider the statement, Jesus died for our sins. The Bible says that Jesus died, he really died on the cross to take the punishment for our sins, to repair a breach in our relationship with God. Christian science says Jesus seemed to die on the cross to demonstrate the unreality of sin, disease, and death, and to show that there is no breach in our relationship with God. So when you say to the Christian scientist, do you agree with the statement, Jesus died for our sins? He can say yes. But what he's thinking it means is not what you are saying it means. So you're talking two different languages, and he doesn't realize that you're speaking two different languages. It's really hard. I was at Principia, I went to my 20th year reunion because I just needed to be there one more time. And there was a seminar on sharing with Christian friends, you know, talking about things. And they use the analogy, even if you guys don't agree on everything, there's peripheral issues, but we all believe in God. So if you imagine God at the center of a wheel and there's spokes on the wheel, if you can direct the conversation toward God, you will come together with the Christian that you're talking with. And I raised my hand and I said, the problem is you're on different wheels. The Christian science God is not the same God as the God of the Bible. So even though you're directing your conversation toward God, you're never going to get on the same wheel. They don't get that, and you can't get that until you step away from the wheel and take a look at it.
What did they say when you said that?
They didn't say anything. Okay. All right, this is a biggie. Doctrine over person and the demand for purity. Matter is unreal, despite what you see, hear, taste, feel, and smell. Regardless of what this environment tells you, it isn't real. That requires constant correcting of one's thought. Eddie said to emerge gently from matter to spirit, implying that you don't have to do this all at once. But then Science and Health and her writings are full of implications and statements that say that if you rely on medicine, for instance, it's going to make the next healing more difficult. Go ahead. Considering the following Christian science teachings. A physical diagnosis of disease, since mortal mind must be the cause of disease, tends to induce the disease. So if you get it diagnosed, it's going to make it worse. Declare that you are not hurt and understand the reason why. Cut my hand? No, I didn't. I'm a perfect child of God and I don't have a physical hand to be cut in the first place. A parent's thinking affects his or her child's health. So if your child is hurt, you don't want to ooh and ah over the wound. You want to separate your thought from it so that you can heal it. A worsening symptoms can be a good thing in Christian science treatment due to chemicalization. Chemicalization is the upheaval produced when immortal truth is destroying erroneous mortal belief. This is from Science and Health. So if you are handling a situation in Christian science and your physical symptoms get worse, that can be a sign that you're actually winning the battle, which is part of the problem where you'll hear stories from Christian scientists, oh yeah, she went to the doctor and they sent her home, they couldn't do anything for her, so why bother? Well, that's probably because she waited so long to go to the doctor that it was too late to get help. And part of the problem is the chemicalization idea that things are getting worse, but no, they're not. You're really handling the situation. The result is a mental juggling act. There's a constant disparity between a person's experience and what they, quote, know to be true. There's a constant reinterpretation of emotions and circumstances to fit the Christian science view of reality. And this is especially hard on children who instinctively need their hurts and their emotions and their feelings to be validated. Children must live with a belief system that tells them that their bodies and the world around them are an illusion. This can make guilt and confusion in a child who feels physical but has to deny it and must reinterpret events that seem very real. These are abstract concepts. Little kids can't do that very well. Many suffer emotional neglect as their parents lovingly tell them that their pain is an illusion. And these are not bad parents most of the time. They're parents who are trying to heal the situation. So if you come and you hold your hand out to mommy and you say, you want to kiss us or make it better, mommy says, we both know that this is no part of you. We know that you're not really hurt. as a child, that's not doing what you need. What you need is mommy to kiss it and make it better. A little kid will run up, and sometimes if a parent doesn't give the child the attention they need, they'll keep acting hurt until they get that kiss, and then they're fine, they go off. What they need is the validation, often more than they need the healing. And it's the validation that isn't present in Christian Science. Thank you. Even if the parent is very loving, it's inherent in the treatment. Barbara Wilson wrote the book Blue Windows, A Christian Science Childhood, and she put it eloquently. She said, to have a body, this I knew deeply without thinking, was to touch and taste and smell your way through a world that was endlessly rich and varied. But in my metaphysical childhood, to have a body was also to have a kind of enemy scout between your mind and the divine mind. A secret agent whose dispatches from the physical world had to be ignored at all costs. You couldn't have thought this up on your own as a child. You couldn't have learned to treat your senses as treacherous. It was a system thought up by an adult. But I did know, without understanding, that you had to have a thing in front of you to realize that it was not really a thing. You had to see a bird to know it wasn't there. And then finally, there's the dispensing of existence. People who leave Christian Science just don't understand it. They are spiritually inferior. We are exclusive. We're cool. And leaving Christian Science opens a person up to aggressive mental suggestion. And so you open yourself up to all that animal magnetism that isn't real but needs to be protected against. And so bad things are going to happen. Which is why when I left and I ended up ill for very valid reasons, it was very embarrassing because I knew all my Christian Science friends and loved ones were thinking that I had opened myself up to aggressive mental suggestion. That would be good for them. Thank you.
We all heard last night about people who've been shunned or cut off.
Pardon?
We heard last night about people who've been shunned or cut off.
And they're also, you hear many, I was not shunned, but many people are shunned when they leave Christian Science. And there is a cutting off emotionally because you no longer share the worldview. You can't relate on the same, you can't relate anymore because they're living metaphysically and you're not. So even if they try not to shun you, there's still a complete separation there. So the more we talked at Wellspring, the more it became apparent that Christian Science does fit Lipton's criteria. The controls are mostly mental, and they're inherent in the teachings. They're inherent in the doctrine. It has to happen if you're a good Christian Scientist. So Wellspring opened up a whole new world to me, and I began to understand the source of my difficulties. I realized that many of my emotional difficulties were very similar to other clients. There were people from various high demand groups and cults who were there, just a few at a time. I got to know several people, and at our core, we had all our humanity, our emotions, all that stuff had been violated. We were suffering very similar fallout from different situations, but we'd all been, it was amazing how similar our wounds were. So I went home and I was just like amazed that Christian Science does fit Lifton, and I had this overwhelming need to write it up. I wanted to capture it on paper. And I've since learned that when I really need to capture something, I have to write, because I've done it in huge numbers of things. So I went home and I wrote a paper describing Christian Science in terms of Lipton's mind control. And I thought, okay, this is going to be my closure. I'm going to feel free. And for about 3 days, I felt great. And then it started. I got this ferocious, relentless internal battle. It just mentally just attacking myself. I couldn't live with myself. It was horrible. And so 5 weeks later, I went back to Wellspring and said, what the heck is going on here? And what it turned out to be was that, have you ever said, I feel this way about, part of me feels this way and part of me feels that way. We all have mixed emotions, and sometimes you feel like a little kid, and sometimes you don't. And it turns out there was a little piece of my identity that took the form of a 4-year-old child who was still stuck in Christian Science. This little part of me had not gotten nurtured. I mean, my parents were loving, but again, You hurt your knee, this isn't a part of you, you don't get the emotional validation. I remember breaking my leg as a 4-year-old, and I was in a full-length cast, and I got wheeled into the Christian Science Sunday School by my Sunday school teacher, and I remember being mortified as a 4-year-old that I had a broken leg because I knew that just wasn't the right thing to be, and I felt very, very embarrassed. So this little piece of me whose identity and beliefs and loyalties and everything had been developed in Christian Science was kind of frozen in time. And you'll learn that as a child, you process memories more emotionally. As you grow up, you process memories emotionally and logically. But a lot of times it's hard to get rid of childhood traumas because as an adult, we can look back and logically see what happened and say, well, that's, you know, it's been resolved, but the emotions still are not healed yet. And that's what was going on inside of me. It's explained why talking about Christian Science had been so difficult. The adult in me would speak out because I knew it wasn't right. I was happy in my new religion. I was delighted to know the Bible better. But this little part of me would say, you can't say that. And it would trigger a grieving process, and it would trigger really a battle to silence the adult part of me. So when I went to Wellspring and we kind of figured out what was going on, my task became to parent this part of me and kind of reintegrate her with my personality. I had to somehow figure out how to reach this child and nurture her in a way that she desperately needed to be nurtured. And this sounds kind of nutty, you know, really, frankly. But I had a gift at the time, and the gift was that I had children of just the age that my little girl was. I had a preschooler, I had a first grader, and I had a young teenager. And so I was around a lot of little kids, so I thought, okay, I need to see what they need. So I began to watch these little kids, and when they had a need, how did they expect that need to be filled? And it comes down to you fall down, you skin your knee, you come to mommy, you say, mommy, I hurt my knee, mommy validates it, kiss it, make it better. What these kids needed was validation, they needed safety, they needed support. And when I had realized at Wellspring that I absolutely hated this little kid inside of me because she was causing so much trouble. And so what I found when I was when I was learning about these little kids, is I realized the needs that this little child in me had were identical to the needs that these other children had. And if I could nurture these other children and love them, why couldn't I nurture and love the child in me? And so my hatred for this little part of me became a nurturing, parenting love. And I learned how to self-nurture. And it was quite a process to go through, but it was really interesting, and it was, you know, because part of me is, the whole time I'm doing this, there's a part of me processing, and there's a part of me going, oh, this is interesting. You know? So it was a fascinating process to go through. But it explains why talking about Christian Science has been so difficult. And grieving, the inside of me, this little part was grieving and loyal to Mary Vicaretti and all this. And so this internal struggle would be that part of me saying, you can't say that, you can't do this. So I learned to love her, and I learned to validate her, and that was great. And at that time, I received a phone call from Timbuktu, who was another former Christian Scientist. Oh, and part of my problem had been, I hadn't been able to find any Christian Scientists who were now Christian. This was in the old days, before the internet, and you just couldn't reach out to people the way you can now. And so I felt very, very alone. Well, there was a list by one of the cult watch groups. There was a list that if you'd been on a certain cult, you could put your name on that list. It's called Refocus. And I got this phone call out of the blue by a guy who was a former Christian Scientist who happened to be a Christian, and he said, hi, I'm a former Christian Scientist. And that was my first contact. So the next week, there was actually going to be a meeting of Children's Healthcare is a Legal Duty, is an organization that tries to close the loopholes in laws that would allow medical neglect in the name of religion. And at the time, they were holding a yearly support group meeting for people who had been in Christian Science. And there was going to be one the next week in St. Louis. And so I actually went to that meeting, and for the first time, I got with a group of people who understood where I had been. There were Christians and non-Christians, atheists, whatever, it was a secular group, but for the first time I got with people and realized that the struggles they were having were the same as the struggle I was having, and it was awesome. It was wonderful to get together and have that validation. And yet I couldn't quite bond with them. And so in pondering that, I realized that this little child in me was still Christian Science and needed to be exit counseled. So then I had to go through a process of not only nurturing this part of myself, but educating this part of myself, deep down in my emotions, to realize that she didn't need or want Christian Science. So one of the helpful things was reading a book by Adam Dickey, and he was Eddie's personal secretary. In the last part of her life, he wrote a book, Memoirs of Mary Baker, and she had asked him to write a book of the memoirs. And it took him 17 years to do it, and he died before he finished. But in 1927, I think, his wife published his manuscript. And he was very devoted to Mary Baker Eddy, but he's very transparent. And he described a lot of, in his loyalty, he describes, and he says that there were a lot of pretty strange quirks she had, and she justifies him as God's messenger. So I'm reading these ridiculous things she's expecting of her people, and realizing that they are validating it because she's God's chosen messenger. And this, I had studied, the qualities of a cult leader. I had studied the profile of cult leaders when I was at Wellspring. And as I'm reading these memoirs from her and from other former Christian Scientists of her day, I'm realizing this cult leader is emerging. And I realized that she treated them the same way a lot of cult leaders do. And this little part of me said, I don't want her to be my leader. And I was able to gain freedom from Christian Science. And so it had taken 11 years, but 11 years after leaving Christian Science finally left me. About that time, I started doing these child meetings. They had them every year, and I went to them from 1996 to 2009, which is when they stopped having them. So every year I would go and I would talk to people there, and became not only, the first 3 years I was there and I was like, I need help. And then after that I went as someone who was helping others who were there. But I found a striking number of stories of this childhood trauma, this unresolved childhood trauma that had happened. And a lot of the people I met were children of practitioners. They were, the leaders in the religion inadvertently neglected and abused their child in the name of healing. And I came to the conclusion, kind of reluctantly, that even in the hands of its best practicers, Christian Science is damaging. That was a huge thing to learn. So how did I end up writing a book? Interestingly, during my time at Wellspring, as we were realizing that Christian Science is cultic, one of my counselors said, "Have you considered writing a book?" And I'm like, no. And he said, we talked about it, and I thought, that is just no way. Well, an hour and a half later, I had this out of the blue, ferocious anxiety attack on the floor, screaming, and it was the thought of writing a book. Because I was not yet free from this little child who was basically saying, you try to write a book and you're dead, that's not going to happen. But once I became free from Christian Science, about that time, Christian Way, which is a group of former Christian Scientists who are now Christian, who have been reaching out to other former and current Christian Scientists. Carol and Poole started the group in, I think, the 1980s, maybe a little earlier than that. And the group had a big heyday, and then it kind of had gone a little dormant because she had become ill and she passed it on to somebody else. And anyway, the time was right. The internet was coming into its own, and it was time to have a website. So a couple people put a website together, a sort of a beginning website, and that opened up a contact so people could write to Christian Way, and I became one of maybe 3 people who were answering the mail. So I was spending, this is starting, say, 1997-ish. I was spending 2 to 3 hours per day answering mail, helping people who were struggling as former Christian Scientists or who were contacting me saying, I've got a loved one in Christian Scientist. I don't know what to do, so talk to us. So I was spending inordinate amounts of time doing this, and over and over and over, and the same issues kept coming up. And finally I said to my husband, you know, if I could write a pamphlet, I might be able to save some time, because then I could do this pamphlet, and we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. So, it was interesting at the first child meeting, Caroline Fraser, who wrote God's Perfect Child, was there. And she was presenting her book. And I said to her, I'm so glad you're writing a book, because then I don't have to. So here I am writing a pamphlet that turns into a book. My goal in writing my book was to help people understand what happened to me, why am I struggling, or why does my loved one act this way? I don't understand how to help them. The strategy in the book was to examine Christian Science against Lipton's criteria that we talked about. I wanted to let the Christian Scientists talk for themselves, so most of the materials I use are by Christian Scientists or pro-Christian Science. I use biographies, I use a lot of Mrs. Eddy's writings, a lot of writings from her inner circle of followers. These would have been the people that lived in her household, or like Gavin Dickey, who was her secretary. I wanted to see how Eddy interacted with her students and with her followers in general. And so I spent about a year researching it. I did thousands of pages of reading, and I used Mary Baker Eddy. I used the Peel biographies. I did use the Catherine biography. No, that is one of the taboo, don't read that. And so some people have discounted my entire book because I referenced that, even though it was like a tiny part of all this pro-Christian Science stuff. But that goes with the milieu control. If I touch that book, you can't believe anything I say. But I basically let the Christian Scientists talk for themselves, and came up with this book that the publisher ended up going out of business within a few years because they were a terrible publisher. And I worked really, really hard to make this book direct but fair. I didn't want to judge. I just wanted to say what happened. I just wanted it to help people, and I wanted to be totally honest. And then they slapped the title on it, The Religion That Kills, Christian Science, Abuse, Neglect, and Mind Control. And they wanted to say abuse, neglect, and murder. And I was just like, you can't do that. You can't do that. And I wrote this book, most people had editors and agents and all. I just sat down and wrote a book. And so my initial editors were my mom and a couple of friends, and I very much didn't have the knowledge, and I didn't know enough that I could fight hard enough to not have this title, because I was not a writer. So anyway, we ended up with this title that I've never been able to live with. And the problem with it is the book is it sets a tone on the book that is sensational and attacking and all this kind of thing, and that's not the tone of the book, and I wanted the title to reflect the book. So anyway, the good thing was I got published pretty quickly, and they had me do 50 radio interviews promoting the book. So my deep need at that point was to speak, was to get the message out. I'd gone from no, you can't say anything to I have to share this. And I was allowed to be on the radio 50 different times, and that allowed me to speak. So it was a good thing, except for the title. And I spoke at a couple of conferences in 2001, and interestingly, one of them I spoke at was in the Cleveland area, and it was a large conference, and the Committee on Publication, the Christian Science Committee on Publication, rented a room smack dab in the middle of it. So here I am at the conference, and there's this room with, on the door, Christian Science Committee on Publication. It was quiet intimidation. So I'm here, I'm listening to you. And I could tell who was in the audience. He just sort of oozed Christian Science. And that's not bad. It's just the way it was. I could just tell who he was. But then, of course, they published something in the newspaper, and then I had to refute it. But anyway, it was interesting that they would never spoke to me, but they just said, we are here, right smack in the middle of what you're doing. Okay, at the same time, the Christian Way website had gone up in about 1997. The book had come out end of 1999. In 2002, or just before that, we decided we needed a better website. That was in the infancy of websites where it was still really hard to do. So anyway, I spent many months putting together a new website. We put a lot of articles on it. It's called christianway.org, and that has been the main website ever since where people come. That, and then later Ananias.org was put up by John Andrews, but it was, you know, it was the main source of information about Christian Science that was on the web. And remember all those hours I was putting in counseling people. I said, let's have a discussion forum so people can talk to each other. So I and another guy have been moderating the Christian Way discussion forum since 2002. And there's been a lot of discussion that goes on back and forth there that's been really helpful for people. It's a community where people can come and say what they need to say or ask what they need to ask. Let me see. Oh, I have to tell you about the nightmare of an editing process I had in this book. Okay, loading the language. Mrs. Eddy does all kinds of weird things with capitalizations and punctuation. Try running that by editors. The book kept coming back when all these things changed. My editors, no, this is the way it's, even within quotes, because they couldn't believe that it was that way. And I finally made this big list of, these are words you cannot touch, because in Christian Science words with Christian Science capitalization, don't mess with it. It was really very torturously and funny. And my daughter was 10 years old at the time, and they would always say, the editor would, this happened like 4 different times, at least. They'd send the book and they'd say, well, we want it back by Tuesday. So I shut myself in the basement and I go through this nightmare editing process, and then I'd send it back. Well, my daughter, who's now 25, told me that at the time, apparently my husband was defending me. He'd say, you do not go in the basement. So she said, when you went, all I know about your book is when you go into the basement, you do not go down there. Not mess with Mom. It's pretty funny. So the Christian Way website has allowed us to reach out to people literally all over the world. We've been a great resource. The book has been helpful to many people. You can put the slide down. In 2010, I reissued the book with a name that I like because my publisher is now out of business. I named it Perfect Peril, Christian Science and Mind Control. Perfect because we're told we're the perfect spiritual ideas of God. Peril because we're in peril physically, spiritually, and emotionally in Christian Science. And I'll just read the blurb that's on the this is a Kindle book. Perfect Peril is a tool for understanding and recovering from the damaging effects of Christian Science. The book examines Christian Science in light of Robert J. Lifton's classic criteria for thought reform and shows how this religion traps its followers in thinking patterns that can harm them emotionally, physically, and spiritually. It also examined Mary Baker and his charismatic personality, leadership style, claim to divine authority, and misuse of biblical terms. Perfect Peril was originally published under the name of Religion It Kills, a publisher post title to which the author strongly objected.
None of that only exists as an ebook. It's
just an ebook, yeah. So where am I now? As you can gather, I went through a really, really hard exiting process in Christian Science, and now I'm at peace. I can honestly say I'm at this meeting, I'm glad to be here, but I don't have any of the painful heart tugs that I would have had 15 years ago. And I say that to encourage you that you can be free. If you're still struggling with things, it may take a lot of work, but you can be free, and it's a battle worth fighting. So thank you very much.